Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Rhoda Madrigal, and we're going to go ahead and get started with today's session. I have pressed record, so we should be good to go. Again, my name is Rhoda Madrigal, and I'll be taking you through today's session. I am joined virtually by some of my colleagues who may speak up during Q&A or to provide clarity when needed as we discuss this topic. And we are here today to talk about the changes being implemented in Phase 1 of the Transmission Service and Market Scheduling Priorities Initiative. In an effort to increase transparency and provide greater service to our stakeholders, we are recording this webinar. It'll be posted on our website so that you can review it in the future and for those who were not able to join today's call. These slides that we are going to go through today are posted on CAISO.com, can be found in the ISO Learning Center under New Modules, and also on the Release Planning page. A bit of housekeeping before we get started here. I've set this up so that everyone is muted when they joined the call. We ask that you keep yourself muted in order to minimize background noise throughout the session. If you would like to ask a question, you can either raise your hand, you can put a note in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask your question. So a couple of different ways to get in touch with us. I do have Monica Minatri on the call with me today as my co-host and producer. We call her Mo, and she'll be helping us. She'll be helping me keep track of if people have questions, making sure I see hands that are raised, and making sure that I'm paying attention to notes that are put into the chat. So thank you in advance, Mo, for your help with facilitating today's call. And we're going to go ahead and get started. First, an agenda so that we can talk about what we're going to go over. This training session today will cover a couple of different topics. First, we're going to go through a high-level overview of the changes. Then I'm going to take you through application-specific details along with screenshots of new screens in Cyber and new reports in Oasis and data that we've already posted to CAISO.com. And then we're going to take a moment to do what I'm going to call a process review. And that really is just to refresh folks' memories about how to register these resources in master file and go over some of the cyber terminology that we've been talking about. And then we'll dive into the market simulation activities for this particular initiative. The objectives for the Transmission Service and Market Scheduling Priorities Phase 1 initiative, the goal first, we're going to be extending the current interim wheeling through scheduling priorities framework for 2022 and 2023 all the way through May 31st of 2024. We are also implementing some things to foster coordination between scheduling coordinators of supporting resources and scheduling coordinators of those folks that are submitting high priority exports. The point of this is to provide additional visibility of the non-RA capacity for a supporting resource, as well as notifications when a high priority export, or you'll hear us refer to these throughout the session today as PT export, when those schedules exceed that non-RA capacity of the supporting resource. So we've implemented a screen that will allow you in Cyber to view, to have that visibility or transparency on that situation. And we'll go over that in detail when we get to the application-specific section. We'll also talk about how we are changing how VERS can support those high priority exports. And we'll talk about the additional data and information that our customers requested be posted and show you where that is located. These next couple of slides have a series of acronyms that you will see throughout today's presentation, and you can refer to those if you are following along with us on the posted slides. Just a couple of pages of different acronyms of what we're going to go over. And now we'll dive into the material. So phase one of this initiative first I wanted to just quickly touch on the implementation timeline here. The tariff amendment for this initiative was filed with FERC January 27th of this year, and we obtained FERC approval on March 15th of this year as well. Next week, we're going to be kicking off the market simulation window for this initiative. That will be from May 3rd through the 20th. My understanding, I believe the structured scenarios are going to begin on May 5th. There will be a market simulation call later today that will touch on that as well. And then finally, the production activation target date for this initiative is June 1st, 2022. So that's the timeline that we're looking at. And now we're going to dive into a high-level review of the changes. So first, with regard to these interim wheeling through scheduling priorities, we are going to be extending this so that high priority wheels are available for external load serving entities that are planning on using the ISO system to meet their reliability needs. The goal and purpose of extending these changes into 2024 is to provide certainty on rules for wheeling through the ISO BA, which will support contracting for summer operations. Now, these high priority wheels are established through a process that hasn't changed, and that is notifying the ISO 45 days prior to the month, the megawatt quantity of that wheel, and also there's some attestation that you have secured firm transmission to the ISO border for the entire month. That change was previously set to expire in 2022, but we are extending that through, and now that will expire on June 1st of 2024. And really the goal there is to provide time for the ISO to work with our stakeholders on a long-term solution to establish a transmission reservation process, and that will be phase 2 of this initiative. So that's the wheeling through extension. This next item, probably the one that I'm most excited about, is this coordination that we are essentially we've designed a screen to help coordinate between supporting resources and the scheduling coordinators that submit high priority exports. So the goal here is to provide that additional visibility of non-RA capacity for those supporting resources, and to also provide a notification when that high priority export or PT export schedule exceeds that non-RA capacity of that supporting resource. We'll go over those details in a few minutes when we take a look at the cyber application specific changes. You'll see how we'll be providing this information in the cyber tool to scheduling coordinators on both the generator and the export side. To both parties will have that information. Another item that is changing is how variable energy resources can support these high priority exports. So right now, the current rules are we require that resources supporting these high priority exports have sufficient capacity for the entire hour, and that would be based on the forecast at the time of bid submission. Having that rule in place creates, frankly, a risk that the forecast may overstate the capacity of the resource that will be available to support the export in real time. So the new rule is going to require that these variable energy resources indicating or that are supporting the high priority exports, that export be based on the most recent forecast ahead of the real-time market close for that relevant hour. So it's possible that the original forecast may no longer be accurate, and a more recent forecast may show that the resource is incapable of supporting the export for the entire hour. This change sets the expectation that if the forecast changes, a scheduling coordinator for a high priority non-recallable export should update their bid accordingly. And so I have an example to kind of take you through the thought process on that. Let's say after the day ahead market closes and the real-time market opens, we have a scheduling coordinator who submit bids for their solar resource. I'm just going to zero in on 1 hour for simplicity's sake. So let's say hour ending 12. And so in that day ahead time frame, when the real-time market opens after the close of the day ahead market, they're inputting bids, and let's say they submit a bid of 250 megawatts for hour ending 12. And then when we get to the actual trade date, we're seeing that the forecast is considerably less, say 190 megawatts. So it really makes sense there that you need to update the bid to the actual forecast. And we're just kind of setting that more in stone to say that you're required to make sure that the resource can support that export quantity for the full hour. So that's that change. And then finally, we're going to be publishing additional requested data and information. So there are some manual reports that are already posted to CAISO.com that provides aggregate historical resource adequacy import data, and also aggregate data on any of the high priority wheels that have been registered. I'll go over more of those details when we get to the application specific piece, including the new Oasis reports that will be providing information about the load forecast adjustments in the different intervals, in RUC, in HASP, in RTPD and RTD, and the aggregate schedule reduction data that we'll be publishing with regard to those schedule changes that happen in RUC and the day ahead, and then HASP in real time. We'll be taking an actual look at what we have there. So before we dive into the application specific details, that's a high-level overview of everything that we're going to be talking about today. Wanted to open it up to see if anybody has any questions yet about what we will be covering. So feel free to either put something in the chat or raise your hand or unmute yourself if you have any questions.
Radha, I do not see any questions in the chat. Again, as Radha mentioned, please feel free to add any of your questions in the chat log.
All right, thanks, Mo. We're going to move on to the application-specific details, which is, I think, what folks want to see and what I'm eager to show you. So we have 3 different things that we'll be showing you today. We have cyber changes in Oasis, and then the manual reports that I was referring to. So we'll dive into that. Cyber first. We are going to be providing the ability for the scheduling coordinator of the supporting resource to have instantaneous visibility of their available non-RA capacity in cyber. So cyber is going to calculate the hourly total self-scheduled exports that are submitted by scheduling coordinators for the same designated supporting resource ID for each supporting resource before the market closes, both in day ahead and in real time. We're going to display this information, the resource, the non-RA capacity, the total submitted self-scheduled exports, and this information is going to be updated whenever these PT export resources submit their schedules. So think of it as real-time information that you're going to be seeing as these bids and schedules are being submitted. Scheduling coordinators will also receive notification when the sum of those PT export schedules exceed that non-RA capacity for the supporting resource. So cyber will notify scheduling coordinators both on the export side and the supporting resource side when the submissions cause that sum to exceed that non-RA capacity. And you'll see that we've implemented kind of a color coding for easy reference that I'd like to discuss with you in a moment. So we have a new tab. It's called the Export Priority Report tab, where you will be able to see all of this information. Today, you get this information through cyber validation rules. That isn't changing, but this is a more comprehensive way of viewing all of that information in one location. again, from a time frame perspective, this information will be updated as these bids and schedules are being submitted. And on the market participant side, what do you need to do? Your job is to make sure that you're coordinating both parties here, the supporting resources and the folks submitting those export schedules. Make sure that you're coordinating when there's an issue and make sure that gets addressed prior to the market closing, either in day ahead at 10 a.m. the day before or prior to the market close at each hour in real time. And the goal there is to make sure that you're able to cover all of those exports so that they don't get converted to a lower priority status. So those are all of the words about what it is that we're going to be changing and how we're going to show it to you. And now I'd like to take a moment here to walk through the new screen and explain how that's going to work. So in Cyber, there is a new tab that's been added. It's called Export Priority Report. And then there are sub-tabs in this section. The first is for generator, and then the second would be for export. So we'll go through those one at a time. You can see over there on the left, we've got a drop down for the day ahead or real time. So depending on what you're looking for, you'll have that information available to you. And then on the screen, I'd like to just kind of give you a quick overview of what we're looking at. Then we'll go through a couple of examples. And then I actually have some questions for you about the way we've implemented this color coding because we'd like to get your feedback. So what you're looking at here is a slice of data. I'm looking at day ahead results for tomorrow's trade date. I'm looking at, I kind of navigated to the middle of the set of 24 hours. So this starts off with hour ending 8. And you can see under the resource ID column that I've got two different resources that I'm seeing. So I've got my resource that ends with SCID2, and then the other one just ends with SCID. So I've got two different resources that I'm looking at here. The next column over, you can see the eligible export capacity, and that would be the total sum of that capacity for each one of those resources. Then you can see the unused export capacity in the next column. If the capacity has not exceeded what is available, you'll see that those numbers showing up in green in that unused export capacity column. And then to the right, you're seeing which export schedules those resources have been identified as a supporting resource for, and then the total amount of megawatts associated with that export. So now we'll walk through an example to kind of orient us to some of what you're going to be looking at. So obviously everything in green here is under that capacity and still may have some capacity available. So we'll take a look at one example here. I'm looking at hour ending 11. I'm looking at this resource here that ends just with SCID. You can see that this is one resource. It has a total eligible export capacity of 22.36 megawatts. And you can see that it's supporting two 10 megawatt exports. So over here on the right, there's something at Blythe, and that's 10 megawatts. And then below that, there's another export. So there's two exports. Both of those exports have identified this as a supporting resource. And because it has 22.36 megawatts available, it's able to fully support both of those exports with a little bit left over. So everything looks good in that space if we're looking at that particular hour, this one particular resource. So I'll draw your attention now to another example. If I'm looking at hour ending 13 here for that same resource, now this is a wind resource, so my capacity varies throughout the day. So we're saying in this particular hour, which is hour ending 13, I have one resource. It has a total eligible export capacity of 14.4 megawatts in this hour. And it is identified as supporting two 10 megawatt exports. In this situation, you can see by the color coding of red and also the negative number in the unused export capacity column, that this resource does not have enough capacity to meet the schedules it is associated with. In this case, the scheduling coordinator of the generator here and on the export side, those two parties need to coordinate to either resubmit or adjust those exports to prevent both of these exports from being converted to a lower priority, which is what would happen if nothing was done. So with that, with those two examples, first I want to see if you have any questions about the examples, and then I'd like to take a moment to talk to you about the color coding and get a little bit of your feedback on that. So first, does anybody have any questions about either of those examples or about what we're looking at on this tab? And again, you can unmute yourself or put a note there in the chat.
Rada, we do not have any questions in the chat, and I do not see any hands raised at the moment.
Okay, thanks, Mo. So now I wanted to take a moment. The team would like me to get some feedback in the development of this section. So
Rada, we do have one.
Oh, go ahead.
And this question came from Amy, and her question is it only the supporting resource SCID that can see this, or does everyone have ability to see the overscheduling?
This would be just the supporting resource. So this is in cyber where you only see your information and your resources. So you, the generator, would see your resources only. Nobody else is going to see your data. On the export side, which we'll go over next, the export that has identified your resource as a supporting resource will be able to see whether or not that resource can fully support the export. So I'll show you on the next tab that we're going to go over what you will see from the export side in this scenario. So we'll hold tight for that.
We have a couple more questions. This individual asked, is the data from this, is the data from this new cyber tab available via API?
Yes, the data will be available via API. There are 2 new APIs being developed for this. I know the names of them are listed on the slides that I've seen for, I think it was the Market Sim presentation, but yes, there's 2 new cyber APIs that are being developed, both for the generator piece of the subscreen and then the export subscreen. And then was there other questions?
One more question. This individual asked, when is the last time this would update so that we can update the bids? Thinking about the real time frame for updating bids.
Right, so day ahead, the deadline is 10 a.m. the day before, right? So as close to when folks are making those changes leading up to 10 a.m. the day before for the day ahead time frame, it's going to be this is updating in real time as those bids and schedules are changing. So you'll get the most updated data up until the market closes, and then from day ahead perspective, and then no changes. So similarly in real time, the real-time market closes 75 minutes before the top of the hour for each trade hour. So you're looking at the similar type of time frame with that. So as you're getting closer to that 75 minutes before the top of the hour is when, when things are going to be tight if you're still working on making adjustments.
No further questions. Thank you, Rada. Actually, one more just came in. This one came from Andrew Crawford, and he asked, does the eligible export capacity include ambient D rates?
Does the eligible export capacity include ambient D rates? I don't know that off the top of my head. I know I have Greg Ford here on the line. I don't know, Greg, if you have the answer to that.
Yeah, Hi, this is Greg. No, the cyber system doesn't have any D rates in it, whether it's ambient or outages, planned or forced. So it's simply looking at, and actually those formulas are in the cyber business rules on our website. But it's basically looking at what's been bid in minus RA capacity. At a high level, that's what it is. We're kind of expecting, though, that if there's an outage you're aware of or a D rate, that your bids should reflect that amount. Does that help?
Okay, Greg, thank you for that. I appreciate that. Thanks.
One more question just came in. This one comes in from Susie. Is this report available for California entities only or all entities?
So this report would be available in cyber for those parties who are directly involved, meaning the scheduling coordinators that are submitting the exports will see the next tab that I'm going to show you, and the scheduling coordinators that are submitting bids on behalf of the supporting resources will see this information and only their information. So this information is confidential and proprietary in cyber, just like all other bidding information is, meaning you see your own information and nobody else's. So there isn't going to be an aggregate report about this posted somewhere else or available somewhere else.
Thank you,
This is Greg. Oh, I just want to add, I think this, we might want to confirm with Wendell, but these the supporting resources, I believe you have to register on the master file, and I don't believe we would allow registration of resources outside the CAISO area to be supporting resources.
Right, so we have, thanks for that mention. I do have a little bit later under the process review section, I have a refresher about registering resources in master file and which types of resources can be registered for what. So we will go over the nuances with the resources and master file registration later, just to refresh folks' memories. All right, any other questions on what we're seeing?
There was a follow-up to one of the individuals who asked about the real-time timeframe for updating bids. They wanted to know, is this like the T90 forecast? T-90 forecast.
Can you perhaps in the chat provide a little bit more context to that question, or if you want to go ahead and get on voice so that I can understand what it is you're asking for? I think I need a little bit more clarity in that space. So while you're thinking on that, I'll go into the question that I wanted to ask folks. Right now we have this screen set up so that green indicates that the export is fully supported, and red is used to visually indicate where these exports are not fully supported. We wanted to take an informal poll with you about the color coding on the UI. They're introducing this as kind of something new and wanted to get your feedback or your take on this. Number one, I guess the question is, how do you like it, or do you like it? Would you prefer to just see red for the exports that are not fully supported? Is there value in seeing both green and red here? Do you like the concept of color coding at all? Would you prefer to not see any color coding? So if you could take a moment here to maybe put some notes in the chat about your preferences. This is an opportunity. We are kind of still a little bit in development of this screen and haven't fully closed that. So, if you like it and you want it to keep it like it is with the red and green, please let me know in the chat. Just, yes, keep it the way it is. Or if you want to say, I think it would be great to see the red, but I don't know that I necessarily need to see the green, you could share that. Or if you don't see any value in the color coding, share that too. So if just give us your thoughts. Again, it's an informal poll, and it'll be used to decide how we're going to display this information to you.
So, Rada, we have a few comments in the chat. Houston Reynolds gave it a thumbs up. He said it's clearer to read. Gio mentioned that he likes the color coding. Again, it's visually easier to read. They like the color. A majority of the folks really like the color coding on here. Amy says, I like the color coding, but the red is difficult to read the numbers. Would be helpful if the colors could be user configurable. And then from Anne, she indicated that she likes the color coding as you show now. And then we also got a clarification from the individual from before regarding the T-90 forecast. I'll go ahead and read that out. This individual states that if they're using the latest forecast to update the bids, real-time bids are due at T-75. What time is the forecast updated prior to the bid submission deadline? Is this at the T-80? And then they ask, trying to assess how much time real-time would have to update bids between the last forecast, update and the bid submission deadline.
Okay, thank you. Yes, that does help provide clarity. I don't know the exact minute time frame, so we're going to take a note to get back to you on that. And what I'll do is I will have the email addresses of everybody who logged into this, and I'll just send a quick email to you with that information, and I'll also find a place in the presentation to make a note of that so that those who are reviewing this in the future can also see that. So we'll take a note to get that exact timing for you, and we'll provide that data to you in email as a follow-up, and also update the slide presentation with that data. So thanks for the question. I'll make sure to get that clarified for you. All right.
Thank you, Rob.
So yeah, great. And I thank you for the feedback about the color coding. I will pass that off to the development team, and so, so that they can have your feedback and comments on that. I want to now move to the other side of the scenario when we talk about, or the other side of these transactions, and talk about the export tab. So here, the export tab, or the export sub-tab underneath the export priority report, shows this view from the other perspective. Now, this is identifying all of the exports and the supporting resource associated with those exports, the megawatt quantity of the export, and then whether or not that export is fully supported. So again, similar to what we're seeing before, you can see a variety of exports that have been scheduled, the resources associated with that, and we'll go through a couple of examples, and then we'll talk to you about the color coding as well. In this first example, I decided to take a look at this instead of at an individual resource level. I decided to use a different take on the example, or a different perspective, and clear this based by the hour that we're looking at. So here I'm looking at hour ending 11, and I want to make sure that all of my exports are fully supported. And so you can see hour ending 11, I've got 3 different exports, and those exports are being supported by 2 different resources, and the Y, or yes, in the fully supported column indicates that these bids are going to retain that PT status at this time. So everything looks good for hour ending 11. if I want to take a look at hour ending 13, in this example, I have a 25 megawatt export that is fully supported, but I can see that neither one of my 10 megawatt exports are being fully supported. And unless I do something to coordinate with those supporting resources, these exports will be converted to the lower priority if not adjusted or resubmitted. And if we're talking about this from a real-time perspective, prior to the market close for hour ending 13. And so this is what you will see from the export side of the house, if you will. All of your exports, the resources lined up to support those, and then whether or not you're fully supported for that export. Now, before I ask you about color coding on this screen, I wanted to see if you have any questions about what we're looking at or about either of the examples.
There are a couple questions from the chat. First one comes from Connor. Connor asks, will the export priority report include reports associated with wheel-throughs?
No, you're not going to see wheeling through transactions on this screen.
Okay, the next one is from Amy. She mentions that this screenshot looks like it's missing the color coding. Shouldn't the ends be in red? And how do you know how much to adjust?
Yeah, good point there, Amy. So with the color coding, and I'll explain what we're seeing and then ask you the question. So first, this display does not have the color coding. You're right, you're not seeing any color coding. They didn't design this screen with the color coding because they kind of wanted to get a feel for whether or not folks like it. So when we get to the color coding question, my question to you all is going to be, what do you think about this screen? You can see that we don't have any color coding. Would you like to see color coding? Do you like the green and red? Do you want just red to show, you know, the areas that aren't being supported? That kind of thing. So if you can be thinking about the way this screen is displayed as compared to the way the previous one was, and let me know if you like both green and red color coding for this screen, or if you just want to see red for the nose, here's your opportunity to share. And then I see a note coming in. Let's see. Are there other questions that I'm needing to capture in order?
There's one from Andrew, and Andrew states, will this screen also show how much eligible capacity is available?
No, the screen is not going to show the eligible capacity for each of the supporting resources. That information is provided to those supporting resources on their side, and so that's where the coordination needs to take place between both parties to determine how to address the shortage, if you will.
And the last question, this individual asks, could we filter by Y for yes or N for no in the fully supported resource column so we could see the ends and what hours we need to make adjustments for?
Yes, absolutely. So we have, and I didn't do an example of this, but it has the same inline filtering concept that you have in Cyber. So if you click on, you can see that funnel up there, you do have the ability to sort and filter this data so that, yes, you could just look for the no's.
One more question, Radha. Will the N have any further information associated with it, like unit derated or unit on outages and so on?
No, at this time, this is all you will be seeing, just that export is not fully supported. And the goal of this was to provide visibility and transparency into that, but then it's really to foster coordination between the supporting resources, scheduling coordinators, and the scheduling coordinators for the exports to kind of work together to figure that out.
No further questions.
All right, so I kind of gave you the preview of the next question that I was going to ask you, which is the informal poll. So if you could take a moment just to put some comments into the chat about the color coding on this screen. You can see that there isn't any color coding. Would you like to see color coding? Do you want red and green? Just red? If you could share your thoughts with us about that so I can share that information with the development team, that would be great. And you can just put that there into the chat. And I think, Mo, if they have a comment about the color coding, we can just, I don't think that we need to recite them. We can just capture that for later and pass those notes on to the development team. So folks, anything you want to write directly to the development team, put those notes in the chat and we'll pass those along.
You got it.
Thanks so much. All right, now the next thing we're going to do is talk about the reports in Oasis. And so I wanted to see, before we move on to those Oasis reports, does anybody have any final questions or comments about either this export subtab or the generator subtab that we looked at on the previous slide, which is this one? Any final questions about the cyber tab?
Sandra asks, are these screens active now?
The screens are not active yet. When we get this activated in MarketSim next week, you will have access to that. But right now, I don't believe it's in there yet.
No further questions.
All right, so I'm going to move to Oasis now.
One more that just came through. Tons of great questions, by the way. So from Amy, she asked, screens look good with the exception of not enough information for exports to know what is available.
Okay, well, thanks, Amy, for that feedback. I'll make sure that we pass that information along. All right, now we're going to switch gears a little bit. We're going to talk about the information that we're going to be sharing in Oasis. We have what we call the RUC load forecast adjustment. So the forecasts get adjusted beyond the, so we have a forecast for each hour, but there may be situations where we make an adjustment to that forecast. We have perhaps a maximum band to procure for RUC, an upper limit that we may be using or activating. And so now, instead of having just a day ahead forecast information, if we make any adjustments to that load forecast and increase that for RUC, we're actually going to be publishing that adjusted load forecast. So first of all, we're looking at a sample report here that doesn't have data. So we're still early in the Oasis report development phase. And so I was able to capture some screenshots from our test environment, but that didn't necessarily mean that I had data to work with. So I'm doing my best to get the report in front of you, but it might not have data in all of the columns. In this case, I just had the column titles, so not populated with data. But what we're showing you here is that this RUC load forecast adjustment report will provide the megawatt targets that the market will use to clear RUC for each hour to cover uncertainty. And so if we make an adjustment to that load forecast, we're going to tell you what that new load forecast amount is and also explain why there was an adjustment. So in that last column there on the right, the load adjustment reason, you will see one of the reasons that were listed on this slide. So it could be demand response, You could see load forecast error. We use that category to cover load uncertainty. You might see a statement there that says fire danger or weather change, reliability coordinator, next day studies. It might say potential loss of resources. What we mean there is we're using that for solar variability, or it might say stranded capacity or reliability concerns. Those are the various reasons you may see in that particular column if we make a load adjustment. So we're looking at this report first from the perspective of RUC. It also gets adjusted, and that's from the day ahead time frame. It also gets adjusted in real time across those various market processes, and I have a screenshot of those coming up, but that's in a little bit. So we're going to kind of go chronologically from day ahead to real time, if you will. So first, this is what the load forecast adjustment report looks like. Does anybody have any questions about this particular report before we move on to the other reports? Okay, I'm not seeing or hearing any questions, so I'm going to move on to the next item. The next item we're going to be talking about, so we're walking through this from a day ahead perspective. So we'll talk about RUC first, and then we'll move to real time and talk about the different reports that are available for real-time content. So from a day ahead perspective, we also have, we're going to be publishing RUC aggregated schedule reductions. This is an example of what that would look like. This report is done in the day ahead time frame in RUC and also real time in the HASP intervals. You'll find this in Oasis, and it will be broken down by a variety of things, which I'll discuss on the next page. Couldn't fit it all in, but first let's just take a look at what we're seeing here. So you'll see the trade date, each individual trade hour, the different types of schedules, the transaction type, whether they're imports or exports, at what particular tie point. So you'll see all of that information displayed here, and I'm going to move to the next screen so we can talk about the other items that we'll see on the report as well. There we go. I'm like, if my screen will move with me. So this RUC aggregated schedule reduction, essentially what we're saying is if there are any reductions to schedules in RUC that have been made for a variety of reasons, for wheels, for imports, exports, or for load reduction, that information right now is provided to individual resources in CMRI, the Customer Market Results Interface. So you have your own information about any schedule reductions, but we're adding an additional layer of transparency, if you will, by providing the aggregate megawatt schedule reductions for that hour across the board. So this will be summarized by BAA, by transmission ownership right. We're going to have different types of schedules. So priority or lower priority, economic, by system, and by tie point. You kind of saw some of those things that I pointed out on the report. These RUC schedule reductions are going to represent the difference in megawatt quantity between the IFM and the RUC process. This reduction would occur due to lack of transmission capability. So you could essentially see, okay, well, we on aggregate had to reduce the schedule this particular hour for, and this particular tie point for, let's say, 100 megawatts. And then the individual schedules that are cut, you'll see, okay, well, my schedule was cut by, let's say, 10 megawatts. And I know on aggregate in this location that, everyone was cut, the total amount of megawatts that were cut were 100. So you get a feel for, we're giving you more transparency about what's happening. I guess you could call it situational awareness, what's happening around you. Today you have your own data. This new report will give you that aggregate data so that you can see kind of what's happening to everybody else. You won't know who else has been cut. You just know how much in total has been cut at that particular location. Does anybody have any questions about this particular report?
As Rada mentioned, if you have any questions, please feel free to add them to the chat log. As of this moment, I do not see any questions in there, Rada.
All right, so that's day ahead. We're going to move to the real-time market. We're going to publish load forecast adjustment data in real time, just like we do in day ahead. It will just be aggregated into different intervals. So the hour-ahead scheduling process, you'll see the load forecast adjustments made. You'll see that happens across 4 intervals in each particular trade hour. You'll see, so that's at the upper left here that we're looking at. This next screen, or the menu option for RTPD, so that's the real-time pre-dispatch or the 15-minute market intervals. Again, each trade hour will have 4 intervals where you'll see that information. And then over on the far right at the top, that screenshot is the real-time dispatch load adjustments. So you'll see for each trade hour, you'll see the 12 different 5-minute intervals and any load adjustment made there. So this particular, in real time, the load forecast adjustment reasons are different than reasons that are adjusted in RUC. Here in real time, you'll see things like load deviation, which we use to cover load uncertainty. It might say software issues, reliability events, or resource deviation. We use that one there for solar variability. So this information, the HASP, the RTPD, and the RTD load forecast adjustments, you're going to have that information available in Oasis. Any questions about this particular report?
There's a question from JP, and JP wants to know, will this report appear under the System Demand tab?
Yes, for the load forecast adjustments, you're going to see that under the System Demand tab. There will be a new report and it'll say load adjustments there. For the schedule reductions, that's going to be under the Energy tab, which I'll show you the next one there in just a moment. So yes, load forecast adjustments appear under the System Demand tab.
There is another question from Andrew, and his question says, how is this different than the sufficiency evaluation demand forecast report?
That's a good question, Andrew. Unfortunately, I'm not intimately aware of the ins and outs of that other report. So what I'm going to have to do here is we'll take a note to compare those and figure those out. I'll talk to the Oasis folks and see if I can get some information for you on that to explain the differences. I'm not super familiar with that other report. So we'll have to get back to you on that. And again, the method of doing so will be a follow-up email to the group. And I have all of your email addresses for those of you that have attended. All right, I'm going to move on to the HASP schedule reductions. This is the same report that we looked at for the RUC schedule adjustments. It's just for the HASP intervals in real time. So schedule reductions only occur in either RUC or in HASP. And so when I showed you what this looks like for RUC, it was kind of just a blank report, if you will. This one, I have a little bit of sample data. It wasn't fully populated, but I was able to kind of give you a feel for what it looks like. So you see that we've got the trade date, the balancing area, the particular intertie, the type of transaction, whether it's export or import, the schedule type, whether it's a self-schedule, whether they're economic bids. and you can see any schedule reduction that occurred across each one of the trade hours. And let's see, what else am I looking at? Okay, and so the next thing that I wanted to show you, so this report is accessible from the Energy tab. So if you hover over Energy up here, and then there's a sub-tab that says Schedule, and then off of the Schedule sub-tab, you'll find this Schedule Reductions report. So that's the navigation path for this. I wanted to go to the next slide, which will give a little bit of an explanation of what we're looking at, and then give you an opportunity to ask any questions. With the HASP schedule reductions, we are calculating the aggregate megawatt schedule reduction in HASP hourly block right after we issue that instruction. And those could be for wheels, for imports, for exports, or for load reduction. And I wanted to point out here that the HASP adjustment here represents the difference between RUC and HASP. And this gets summarized. Again, you kind of saw how that gets organized by the different schedules and economic or self-schedules of different priority by system and by tie point. So you'll see how those get organized. Today, you would have seen this information in individual resource data provided in CMRI if your schedule was reduced in those HASP runs. Again, what we're doing with publishing this information, both for the day ahead RUC process and in real time in HASP, is to give you that kind of added layer of transparency so that you can see for situational awareness what is happening around you. So you'll have your individual resource data about that schedule reduction in CMRI, how it is today, but this new report will give you that aggregate data provided in Oasis. Any questions about this report?
There are no questions in the chat.
All right, there's a couple other things that I wanted to show you as well. Switching gears a little bit, this is part of information that our customers ask us to provide in order to give them more visibility and transparency here. So we have, as part of this initiative, provided 2 years of historical data on RA import, and we've aggregated that by tie location as part of this initiative. I do also want to note that we plan to update this data on a regular basis in the future as one of the items that gets rolled out with the maximum import capability enhancements project. So right now, when you look at this report, I've given you the path to go find this. It's on the reliability requirements or on the planning page in the reliability requirements section, and I've also given you a direct link to the spreadsheet at the bottom here. This report shows you it's one-time data that contains 2 years of historical data, and we're aggregating these RA import showings based on their scheduling point. So like I said, it's 2 years of historical data to take a look at. I know that this data will be updated in the future when we are able to implement that as part of a future enhancement in that maximum import capability project. So right now you get this 2 years of data to help provide context and information to you about what we've got going on with RA and these particular locations. So this is one report. I have another report to show you, but before we do that, I wanted to check to see if anybody has any questions on this one.
Again, as Rhoda mentioned, if you would like to provide any additional questions, please feel free to add them to the chat or raise your hands. As of this moment, Rhoda, I do not see any additional questions.
All right, thanks, Mo. There's another report I wanted to show you, and that is a report that we will be updating when new registrations get submitted. So this particular report provides data on those priority wheel-through transactions that get registered, and we'll go through the registration process in just a moment. But essentially what we're doing in this report is we're aggregating those PT wheel registrations at their import or export points and updating it as new registrations come in. So this is an example of what you would be looking at. And I've given you the report navigation to get to there. This is also on the planning page under reliability requirements, and also a direct link to the spreadsheet down there at the bottom. So again, these last two items that we're talking about, the goal with that was to provide additional transparency and information that our market participants requested. This information is already out there, posted on CAISO.com. These are manual reports that folks here at the ISO have generated. This particular report will be updated every time there is a new registration that's submitted. The other report that I had showed you on the previous page, that is this one here, that's 2 years of aggregate data. That was a one-time report. So that was for 2020 and 2021, and that report isn't being changed at this time. Not until we implement data updates with a future project. So back to this one that I'm looking at, the priority wheel through transactions. Any questions on this one?
No questions in the chat.
All right, so this slide kind of answers or takes the place of asking that question. Now I wanted to move on to another thing. One of the things that our customers have indicated is that they like to see an explanation of, not only what is changing, but kind of the entire process of how things work. And so I wanted to take a moment with this particular initiative to talk about things that this is how it already exists today. And we have done some training on this in the past when this was rolled out last year as part of summer readiness. But I thought it would be a good opportunity to take a refresher on just a couple of topics to make sure we're all on the same page with this. So we're going to talk about registering resources in master file, and we're also going to talk about briefly some cyber terminology.
So Rhonda, before we move forward, we do have one more question that came in, and this one came from Amy. Her question is specific to the priority wheel-throughs. She wants to know if they're separate from ETC.
Yes, I believe the priority wheel-through is something separate that you register specifically, and it's different from an ETC or an existing transmission contract.
No further questions.
All right, so we are going back to, this is taking a step back and just refreshing us about how things work in master file. I think there was a question about different resources and what types of exports they can support. So number one, there are specific fields in master file to identify resources supporting exports or PT wheeling scheduling priorities. There's also a process to register a new PT wheel resource ID using the new intertie resource request form. And so there's kind of 3 different things you could be doing in master file associated with this kind of import, exports, or wheels. So first of all, the generator resource data template is for resources that are located inside of the CAISO BA, used to identify ISO internal supply resources that can support PT exports. And you update existing data either via the master file UI or the API for your generator resource data template. So that's internal supply resources inside of the ISO footprint. There is a different template, the intertie resource data template, and that is for resources that are outside of the CAISO BA, or if we're looking at this from a real-time market perspective, they're also outside of a WEIM entity BA. So these are export system resources that can support PT wheels. So those get registered as a resource that can support those types of transactions on this intertie resource data template. And then finally, in order to register a high priority wheel, there is a different form. It's a new intertie resource request form. And the first 2, the GRDT and the IRDT, those updates are done directly in master file. This other form, you fill that out and you send those requests to rdt@kaiso.com, so a slightly different process. So this one slide is kind of a snapshot of the overview of how all of that works. And then we're going to just walk through each of the different forms to refresh your memory about how you can identify resources to support these exports. Again, with this particular item here, this isn't, there aren't any changes being introduced here as part of this initiative. This is just a refresher on how you register these resources. So the GRDT, the Generator Resource Data Template, Cyber will receive this master file flag that identifies whether these resources can or cannot potentially support a self-scheduled export. The field defaults to null, and the SC must select yes to activate it. In other words, you would need to go in there and identify your internal supply resources that can be used to support these PT exports. There is a field for it on the GRDT, and if you submit a yes in that field, you're indicating my resource is capable at the time of bid submission of supporting an hourly block schedule over the operating hour equal to that PT export quantity. If I am a VER, I can support the export quantity in all 15-minute intervals. And this capacity has already been forward contracted only with an external load serving entity. So there's a couple attestations that you are confirming when you select yes in that column, and I'll show you what column that we're talking about here. So there is the export support column right here, column DE on this resource tab, that you would set it to yes to identify ISO internal supply resources that can support those PT exports. Changes here are subject to the master file 5 business day timeline as it works today. So that's just a review of what that GRDT looks like and which column we're talking about that you would use to indicate your resource can support those PT exports. I'm going to go over the IRDT and then we'll take questions on master file in general. So for the IRDT, that's the intertie resource data template. So here is where you're identifying export system resources that can support those wheeling transactions. Again, this defaults to null. We've added a couple of new fields last year as part of summer readiness, and these are the PT wheel schedule and the PT wheel megawatts. And essentially, you are requesting that we activate these fields or designate an existing export resource that you already have in your system by populating those particular fields in the IRDT. And you can define a wheel schedule as high priority by creating a new export system resource that will be designated through the use of a master file flag as capable of supporting the PT wheel. And indicating that you meet all of these criteria, which I'll click over to here so we can see what we're talking about. Essentially what we're saying is my wheel is supported by a firm supply contract to serve load in another BAA outside the KISO for the month. And I've got firm transmission contract to support that from source to scheduling point in these particular hours, Monday through Friday, excluding holidays. Again, no change to that, but just a refresher on what that process is and then what it looks like. So we've got those PT highlighted over here, export leg of wheel, PT wheel schedule and PT wheel megawatts.
Rada, we do have a question that just came in from Tricia. She asked, can you register a resource as a PT wheel while using the ETC rights?
You know, I'm unsure of how that works. So we'll need to double check and get the correct answer for you on that. And we'll make sure to follow up and provide that to you as well. So thanks for the questions. Some good questions today. We'll make sure we get that answered for you. All right, so I showed you the GRDT and the IRDT. Any questions about either of those before we move on to the process of how to register a high priority wheel? Does anybody have any questions about the two templates?
Again, as Rhoda mentioned, if you have any questions, please feel free to add them to the chat. As of this moment, we do not have any questions specific to those two items.
All right. And again, this is just a refresher on how the process works. So it could be that folks are really familiar with that, so that's good. Now, the high priority wheels, you can find this on the Network and Resource Modeling page. There's a new intertie resource request form that you would fill out and submit 45 days prior to the month. So here's a little snapshot of our website and where you can find it, along with the navigation path, and then what the form actually looks like. So this is a picture of what it looks like, and then there's an instructions tab here where you would click on that for more information about how to complete that form, but this is what you would fill out in order to register that high priority wheel and submit that prior to 45 days before the month starts, so that we can get that from you. Any questions about this process?
I do not see any questions in the chat as of this moment.
All right, we're going to move on to talking about some cyber terminology. Now, this is a quick refresher. I've been saying PT exports, and we've been looking at cyber, and I wanted to kind of just make sure we're all on the same page with terminology. When we talk about a PT export, if you're looking at the cyber UI, you'll see that indicated at SSSTD, or a self-schedule standard, indicating that that is a self-schedule with a designated resource. There's also other terminology like LPT, so lower priority export. In cyber, you'll see that as SSLPT. So that's a self-schedule that does not have an identified resource. Then there's PT wheels that we've discussed, and those are self-scheduled wheels that meet the tariff criteria for high priority wheeling through transaction. I know that that kind of sounds like a nebulous answer, but there's very specific criteria in the tariff about how that would actually work. And so there's either a high priority or a low priority wheel, depending on whether or not you meet that tariff criteria. So you'll be designated as one of those. A little note down there at the bottom when we're talking about wheeling in cyber, it's a bit more complex when you're looking at the wheel. The wheel will indicate SSSTD from the import side, so a self-schedule standard on the import side. And then on the export side, it could either be a self-schedule standard, or it could also be a self-scheduled LPT, which means a self-schedule that has no identified resource. So looking at that in cyber can be a little bit complex. We wanted to point that out to you. If you have a wheel on a registered intertie, the export cannot name a supporting resource, as just another note. So this is just a little bit of cyber terminology here for you.
So Rhoda, we have a question from Amy, and her question is, of these 4 self-schedules, what is the priority of each, and also which is the highest and which is the lowest?
Thanks for that question, Amy. I don't have answers to that in my brain, but I do have answers to that question in the presentation that we gave last year as part of summer readiness. And so as we're going through a little bit more of the information, Mo, I'm wondering if you could take a moment to find, and if you can't find it in just the next few minutes, we'll also send it out in the email. There is, or actually, if you go to the presentation slides that are posted, I have a link to the old training that we did last year. So, and I have a link to that in the reference section of these slides. So if you go to the last slide in this slide presentation, there's a link to a presentation that will talk about the priority and show you in order which is highest to lowest. So I didn't include all of the data from that presentation from last year, but I did include the link to that presentation in these slides in the reference section. So actually, Mo, I don't need you to go find that link because I just remembered that I stuck it there at the end of the slide deck. So you can find that there at the end of the slides, Amy. It will go into a little bit more clarity about all of the different priorities and what the order is. And Mo, thanks for being proactive and putting a link to that presentation there in the chat. Appreciate you. So that was just a quick review of both the master file registration and also some cyber terminology. Does anybody have any questions before we turn to the discussion and start talking about market simulation?
Looking at the chat, there are no additional questions as of this moment. And if you have any questions, please feel free to go ahead and add them to the chat.
All right, let's move on to talking about what you will need to do next week when we're getting into Market Sim. So in Market Sim, we have structured scenarios to give you the ability to preview and test what we've been looking at. So you'll be able to view the resource support capability and export support status. That is that export priority report new tab that we've added to cyber, and you'll be able to see that in action. And you'll also be able to view those reports that we've previewed, both for RUC schedule cuts and HASP schedule cuts as well. So we'll take a look at the various Market Sim scenarios that have been the structured scenarios, if you will. So there's 3 structured scenarios. And of course, there's unstructured testing that you can be doing on the other, you can do your own testing as well. But the first scenario relates to viewing the resource support capability and the export support status. So scheduling coordinators for supporting resources are going to be submitting various combinations of bids. And then on the export side, those SCs are going to be submitting bids for those exports, identifying various different supporting resources and different megawatt quantities. And then you will be able to collectively look at the UI, see your resources and how they're supporting and which exports they're designated to support, and whether or not any of that exceeds the capacity of that resource in any of those hours. And then on the export side, you'll be able to see whether your exports are fully covered and maybe have a conversation about how you would coordinate that among the various parties. So that is the first scenario, just to give you an opportunity to see that export priority report tab in action. The second scenario relates to RUC schedule cuts. So there's that schedule reduction report. So what we are going to do on our side is create a scenario where we are in under-gen conditions, and then go through the motions of cutting load and export schedules so that you would be able to take a look at what those reports would look like, to see various loads, exports, or wheels cut throughout that process. And then you would be able to see that aggregate listing of schedule cuts to give you a feel for how that would work in practice. And also, we're going to be doing the same thing. So RUC would be for day ahead. HASP is going to address real time. And so you'll be able to see those real time cuts that are made. We're going to be doing the same thing where we'll be introducing under-gen conditions to the market that are conducive for cutting load and export schedules. And then you'll be able to see a mix of these schedules being cut during the HASP process and take a look at those schedule cuts, those new reports. With regard to Market Sim, I know that they wanted you to register for those particular scenarios by April 7th. So I'm assuming by now that everybody has done that, because I'm imagining you've been participating in these Market Sim calls. But if not, I would suggest that you reach out to marketsim@kaiso.com immediately to see what could be done. You have to obviously make sure that you're provisioned for access to the map stage environment in order to participate and view these applications in Market Sim. And then we also ask that you please attend the market simulation calls to stay informed on the timing of activities for this initiative and all of the other initiatives. For example, I know we opened the Market Sim window on May 3rd for this initiative, but I think that the structured scenarios are kicking off on May 5th, if my memory serves me correctly. We do have a Market Sim call later this afternoon where you can get more information about those 3 particular scenarios and what you'll be doing or what you might expect to see. So I thought we could open it up for any final questions, either about Market Sim or anything covering anything, any questions on anything that we have covered today. Here is your opportunity to ask them.
As Rhoda mentioned, please feel free to go ahead and add your questions onto the chat log or raise your hands if you want to vocalize those questions. Rhoda, as of this moment, I do not see any questions in the chat.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for participating in today's session. I did want to mention that you can find in the slide deck that is located on kaiso.com more information at the end in reference material. So links to the structured scenarios, the business requirements document, links to the presentation from last year that covered this topic when it was first introduced, along with the adjustments to those priority statuses. You'll be able to take a look at that. If you have any questions on anything presented here today, please email them to customerreadiness@kaiso.com. As I mentioned, we are recording this webinar, so once that recording is complete, we will post it on our Learning Center for you to take a look at. And thank you very much for your participation today. This concludes our webinar, and we hope you found it useful and informative, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.